The rifle spun through the air, 10 pounds of polished wood and steel rotating end over end against a cloudless sky. And then it wasn't rotating anymore. It was falling, tumbling. The young Marine's hands closed on empty air as the weapon slipped past his fingertips and clattered against the pavement with a sound that made 2,000 spectators wince. What happened next has been viewed over 40 million times, and if you think you know how this story ends, you don't. Not yet. Type respect in the comments if you believe some skills never fade, because the elderly man watching from the front row was about to prove something that the Marine Corps has known for 60 years. His name was Harold Briggs, 79 years old, leaning on a weathered wooden cane wearing a faded blue windbreaker that had seen better decades. To anyone watching, he looked like what he appeared to be, an old man who'd arrived early to get a good spot at the Memorial Day parade. Nothing more, nothing remarkable, but the way he watched the silent drill platoon wasn't the way most people watched. His eyes tracked each rifle with the precision of a metronome. His fingers tapped against the head of his cane in time with the cadence, and when that rifle hit the ground, something shifted in his expression. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time. The Marine Corps Silent Drill Platoon is considered one of the most elite ceremonial units in the world. 24 hand-picked Marines performing a series of calculated rifle drill movements with fixed bayonets, all without a single verbal command. The routine demands perfection. The margin for error is 0. And the 10.5-pound M1 Garand rifles they spin, toss and catch have been modified to weigh even more than standard issue. Over 11 pounds with the chrome plating and welded bayonet. That's what makes what happened next so extraordinary. And so impossible to fake. The fumbled rifle didn't just fall, it bounced. The stock caught the edge of the platform and sent the weapon spinning toward the crowd barrier like a chrome-plated missile. People gasped. A woman pulled her child backward. A man in a polo shirt stumbled trying to get out of the way. The rifle skidded to a stop 3 feet from Harold Briggs's orthopedic shoes. For a moment nobody moved. The platoon stood frozen in formation, the young Marine who'd dropped the weapon staring at the ground where his career had just shattered. The platoon commander's jaw was tight enough to crack walnuts. 2,000 people held their breath. Harold looked down at the rifle. Then he looked up at the young Marine. And something passed between them. Something that had nothing to do with words. The old man's cane clattered to the ground. A security officer near the barrier started forward. "Sir, don't touch that. Sir, step back, please. That's military property." Harold didn't seem to hear him. Or maybe he heard and simply didn't care. His right hand reached down, fingers curling around the stock with a familiarity that spoke of 10,000 repetitions. He lifted the rifle, 11 pounds of polished steel and walnut, and he lifted it like it weighed nothing at all. "Sir," the security officer's voice was sharper now, "I need you to put that down immediately." Harold's eyes never left the young Marine's face. His left hand came up, finding the barrel's balance point without looking. And then he did something that made the security officer stop dead in his tracks. He spun the rifle on a single finger, not awkwardly, not shakily. The weapon rotated around his index finger like a silver pinwheel, catching the morning sun and throwing light across the stunned faces of the crowd. 1 rotation, 2, 3. The rifle moved with mechanical precision, as if it had been doing this its entire existence, and Harold Briggs was simply reminding it how. Someone in the crowd started recording on their phone, then someone else, then 20 people, then 100. The security officer had frozen with his hand still extended, mouth open, brain trying to reconcile what his eyes were telling him with everything he thought he understood about old men and heavy rifles. Harold caught the weapon mid-spin, snapping it to port arms with a crack that echoed off the surrounding buildings. The movement was textbook perfect. The kind of perfect that takes years to achieve and decades to maintain. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The young Marine who dropped his rifle was staring with an expression that had shifted from shame to something else entirely. Something like recognition. Not of Harold's face. He'd never seen this old man before in his life. But recognition of what he was seeing, of what it meant. "Where did you learn that?" The security officer's voice had lost its authority. It was just a question now. Just genuine human curiosity wrapped in confusion. Harold didn't answer. Instead, he executed a perfect inspection arms, the bolt sliding back with a metallic chunk that made every veteran in the crowd sit up straighter. His movements were slower than they would have been 50 years ago, but the precision was unchanged. The angles were still perfect, the timing was still exact, and then he began to perform. The rifle flipped from his right hand to his left, passing behind his back in a movement called a back pass that took most ceremonial guards months to master. He caught it without looking, the weapon seeming to float from one hand to the other as if gravity had decided to take a coffee break. A single-hand toss followed, the rifle rotating twice before landing back in his palm with a solid smack. The crowd had gone absolutely silent. 2,000 people watching a 79-year-old man perform rifle drill that most active duty Marines couldn't match. Someone in the silent drill platoon broke formation. The platoon commander, a gunnery sergeant with ribbons covering half his chest, took 2 steps forward. His face had changed. The rigid discipline had cracked, replaced by something that looked almost like reverence. Harold performed a right shoulder arms, then a left shoulder arms, the transition smooth as water over river stones. He executed an order arms, the rifle butt striking the ground with exactly the right amount of force at exactly the right moment. And then he did something that made the gunnery sergeant stop breathing entirely. He performed the Queen Anne salute. For those who don't know, the Queen Anne salute is one of the most difficult and dangerous movements in ceremonial rifle drill. The rifle is thrown vertically, rotating end over end, while the performer drops to one knee. The catch must be made with a bayonet pointing skyward, the weapon balanced on a single palm. It's been part of the silent drill platoon's routine since 1948, and it takes an average of 18 months for a Marine to master it safely. Harold Briggs performed it in the middle of a Memorial Day crowd, like he was picking up a fallen newspaper. The rifle launched. The old man dropped. His knee hit the pavement with a sound that made several people wince, but his eyes never left the spinning weapon. 1 rotation, 2. The chrome caught the sun and scattered it like diamonds. Harold's palm came up, steady as a surgical table, and the rifle landed perfectly vertical, bayonet pointing at the cloudless sky. The crowd erupted. Not polite applause, a roar. The kind of sound that only happens when 2,000 people simultaneously realize they're witnessing something they'll tell their grandchildren about. People were on their feet. Phones were held high. Somewhere in the back, a man in a VFW cap was openly weeping. But Harold wasn't done. He rose from his knee, his face showing the effort that his movements had hidden. The rifle came down from its vertical position, and he began a series of flourishes that the crowd couldn't even follow. Spins that blurred the weapon into a silver circle. Tosses that seemed to defy physics. Catches that happened behind his back, under his arm, between movements so fast they registered only as impressions. The gunnery sergeant had crossed the barrier now. He stood 10 feet from Harold, his dress blues pristine, his face a battlefield of emotions, wonder, recognition, and something else. Something that was building behind his eyes like pressure before a storm. Harold finished his impromptu performance with a perfect present arms, the rifle held vertically in front of his chest, bayonet gleaming. His breathing was harder now, his shoulders rising and falling with the effort of movements his body remembered, but his lungs questioned. But his eyes were clear, his hands were steady, and the rifle hadn't wavered once. The gunnery sergeant came to attention, and then he did something that made the crowd fall silent again. He saluted. A Marine gunnery sergeant in full dress uniform, saluting a 79-year-old man in a faded windbreaker. Sergeant Major Briggs. The voice came out rough, as if the words were fighting their way past something stuck in his throat. "I thought you were dead, sir." Harold's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Something old and tired and proud all at the same time. "Gunny," he nodded once. "Not dead, just retired." The gunnery sergeant's salute held. "Sir, permission to inform the crowd who they've been watching." Harold hesitated. 50 years of avoiding exactly this moment weighed against the faces in the crowd, against the young Marine who dropped his rifle and was staring at him like he'd just watched a ghost perform miracles. Finally the old man nodded. Just once, just barely. The gunnery sergeant turned to face the crowd. 2,000 people, hundreds of cameras. His voice carried without amplification, trained by years of drill fields and parade grounds. "Ladies and gentlemen," he paused, letting the silence build. "The man you've just witnessed is Sergeant Major Harold Briggs, United States Marine Corps, retired. From 1968 to 1989, he served as the senior drill instructor for the silent drill platoon." A murmur ran through the crowd, but the gunnery sergeant wasn't finished. During his 21 years with the platoon, Sergeant Major Briggs trained over 400 ceremonial guards. He personally developed 17 of the movements that are still performed today. He holds the record for the most consecutive performances without a single error, 2,347. The murmur became a rumble. People were looking at Harold with new eyes, trying to reconcile the man they'd seen arrive with a cane with the legend standing before them. In 1972, Sergeant Major Briggs performed for Queen Elizabeth II at the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo. The Queen reportedly asked him to perform an encore, the only time in the tattoo's history that a request for an encore has been granted to a foreign military unit. In 1975, he represented the United States at the NATO ceremony in Brussels, performing a solo routine that was described by the Belgian Minister of Defence as the most perfect display of military precision I have ever witnessed. Harold's jaw tightened. He hadn't heard these words spoken aloud in decades, had tried, in fact, to forget that they could be spoken at all. The gunnery sergeant continued. In 1983, during a performance at Camp David, Sergeant Major Briggs noticed a malfunction in a fellow Marine's rifle mid-routine. Without breaking formation, without missing a single beat, he adjusted his own movements to cover the error, absorbing the failing Marine's role while maintaining his own. President Reagan personally presented him with the Meritorious Service Medal afterward. The citation reads, "For exceptional skill, dedication, and presence of mind that prevented what could have been a diplomatic embarrassment and transformed it into a demonstration of Marine Corps excellence." The crowd was absolutely silent now. Even the children had stopped fidgeting, sensing that something important was happening. After his retirement in 1989, Sergeant Major Briggs disappeared from the ceremonial community. He declined all interview requests. He refused to attend reunions. He turned down 3 separate offers to serve as a consultant for the platoon. The gunnery sergeant's voice softened slightly. Many of us thought he'd passed away. His name is still spoken at every silent drill platoon graduation. We tell our new Marines about the man who could spin a rifle in his sleep, about the legend who taught us that perfection isn't a goal, it's a standard. He turned back to Harold, his salute still holding. "And now I know why you never came back, sir, because you never left. You're still doing it, every day, in your mind, in your hands." For the first time, emotion cracked across Harold's weathered face. His eyes grew bright. His grip on the rifle shifted slightly, fingers pressing against the wood like they were greeting an old friend. "The muscle memory," Harold said quietly. "It never fades. You think it will. You tell yourself it will. But then you pick up a rifle, and your body remembers everything your mind tried to forget." The young Marine who'd dropped his weapon had pushed through the barrier now. He stood beside the gunnery sergeant, his face a mixture of shame and awe. "Sergeant Major, sir. I'm sorry, I dropped it. Harold's free hand came up, stopping him. "Son, what's your name?" "Lance Corporal Davis, sir." "Davis?" Harold nodded slowly. "How long you been with the platoon?" 8 months, sir." 8 months. The old man's expression softened. Something almost like a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "You know how many rifles I dropped in my first year?" Davis shook his head. 14. Harold's voice carried to the silent crowd. 14 rifles in 12 months. Busted the stock on 2 of them. Nearly impaled my spotter once. My drill instructor told me I had hands like baseball mitts and the coordination of a drunk ostrich. A laugh rippled through the crowd. Even the gunnery sergeant's lips twitched. "You want to know the difference between a good Marine and a great one?" Harold stepped closer to the young Lance Corporal. "It's not talent. It's not natural ability. It's what you do after you drop the rifle. Do you let the shame eat you alive? Do you walk away? Or do you pick it up and try again?" Davis's eyes were locked on Harold's face, drinking in every word. "I spent 51 years with a rifle in my hand, son. First 20 in combat, last 21 in ceremony, and I'm going to tell you something they don't put in the training manuals." Harold leaned in slightly. "Every single performance, I was terrified. Every single toss, I thought this might be the one I drop. Every single catch, I said a little prayer that my hands would remember what to do." "But you never dropped one," Davis said. 21 years without an error." "No," Harold shook his head. 21 years of catching them anyway. 21 years of not letting the fear make the decision for me." He pressed the rifle into Davis's hands. "Now get back in formation. You've got a routine to finish." Davis stared at the weapon in his hands. His fingers were trembling slightly. "Sir, I don't know if I can—" "I didn't ask what you know," Harold's voice had shifted. The softness was gone, replaced by something harder, something that had trained 400 Marines and turned them into artists. "I told you what you're going to do. You're going to get back in formation. You're going to execute the remainder of the routine, and when you toss that rifle, you're going to catch it. Not because you're sure you can, because catching it is the only acceptable outcome. Is that understood, Lance Corporal?" Davis came to attention. "Yes, Sergeant Major." "Then move." The young Marine moved. He climbed back over the barrier, rejoined the formation, and took his position. The platoon reformed around him, their faces showing nothing of the chaos that had just unfolded. 24 Marines standing ready. Harold retrieved his cane from where it had fallen. His movements were slower now, the adrenaline fading, the reality of 79 years reasserting itself in his joints. But his eyes remained clear. His bearing remained straight. The gunnery sergeant lowered his salute finally. "Sergeant Major, the platoon would be honoured if you would remain for the rest of the performance." Harold considered the offer. The crowd was still watching, still recording. The silence had transformed into something electric, crackling with anticipation. "One condition," Harold said. "Name it, sir." "When that young man tosses his rifle, you don't stop the routine if he drops it. You let him try again, right there, in front of everyone." The gunnery sergeant hesitated. It violated every protocol, every standard of ceremonial performance. The routine was choreographed down to the fraction of a second. There was no try again built into the silent drill platoon's manual, but something in Harold's eyes told him this wasn't a request. "Yes, Sergeant Major." The routine resumed. The crowd watched in breathless silence as the platoon moved through their formations. Rifles spun and flew and were caught with mechanical precision. Bayonets gleamed in the morning sun. The only sounds were the crack of wood against palm, the stamp of boots on pavement, the rhythmic breathing of 24 Marines performing at the absolute peak of human coordination. And then it was Davis's turn. The formation shifted, placing him at the centre. The rifle in his hands seemed to weigh 1,000 pounds. His face was pale. His shoulders were tight. Everyone could see it. Everyone knew what was about to happen. Harold watched from the front row, leaning on his cane. His lips moved slightly, silently. Words that no one could hear. Words that might have been a prayer or a command, or simply the cadence count that had lived in his head for 50 years. Davis threw the rifle. Time stretched like taffy. The weapon rotated through the air, chrome flashing, bayonet turning. Davis's hands came up. His eyes tracked the spin. His fingers spread, ready to receive. The rifle landed perfectly in his palms. The crowd exploded again. Cheers erupted from every direction. People were stomping their feet on the bleachers. The man in the VFW cap was crying again, this time with a massive grin on his face. Harold Briggs nodded once. Just once. His hand found the head of his cane, fingers wrapping around worn wood that had supported him through more miles than he cared to count. But his eyes stayed on Davis, on the young Marine whose career had almost ended 5 minutes ago, on the proof that some things, the important things, could be passed down from one generation to the next. The routine continued. More tosses, more catches, each one building on the last, the platoon feeding off the crowd's energy, and the crowd feeding off the platoon's precision. It was, by all accounts, one of the finest silent drill platoon performances in recent memory. But that's not what people remember when they talk about that day. They remember the old man, the cane that clattered to the ground, the rifle that spun on a single finger like it was performing a dance it had known forever. They remember the salute, the tears, the young lance corporal who dropped his weapon and picked it up again. They remember what it looked like when a 79-year-old man proved that some skills don't live in the body. They live somewhere deeper, somewhere that age can't touch and fear can't reach. Here's what the viral videos don't show you. After the performance, Harold Briggs was escorted to meet the entire platoon. He spent 3 hours with them, critiquing their form, demonstrating techniques, telling stories from a Marine Corps that many of them had only read about in history books. He showed them the proper wrist position for a back pass. He explained the breathing technique that kept his hands steady during the Queen Anne salute. He told them about the night before his first performance for President Nixon, when he'd thrown up from nerves and nearly resigned from the platoon entirely. "I was 23 years old," he told them. I'd been in Vietnam. I'd seen things that should have made a parade feel like nothing. But standing there, knowing that I was about to represent every Marine who'd ever worn the uniform, that was the most terrified I've ever been. "How did you get through it?" one of the younger Marines asked. Harold was quiet for a moment. I remembered something my grandfather told me. He was a Marine too, Iwo Jima, and he said, "Fear is a compass, not a cage. It shows you what matters. What you do next is what shows you who you are." He looked around at their faces, young and old, fresh recruits and seasoned veterans, all of them bound by the same traditions, the same standards, the same unspoken understanding of what it meant to carry a rifle not as a weapon, but as a symbol. "A silent drill platoon isn't about tricks," Harold continued. "It's not about impressing crowds or making videos. It's about precision, discipline. The idea that every single movement, no matter how small, has to be perfect, because perfect is the only thing that honors the people who came before you. Every time you toss that rifle, you're not just tossing a weapon, you're tossing the entire history of the Corps, and every time you catch it, you're saying, 'I understand what this means. I accept the responsibility.'" Lance Corporal Davis found Harold after the meeting. The young Marine's eyes were red, his voice unsteady. "Sergeant Major, I wanted to thank you for what you did out there, for what you said." Harold studied him. "You married Davis?" "No, sir." "Girlfriend?" "Yes, sir, back in Ohio." "When you see her next, you tell her something for me." Harold's hand found Davis's shoulder, gripping with surprising strength. "You tell her that her Marine dropped his rifle in front of 2,000 people, and then he picked it up and finished the job. You tell her that's the kind of man she's choosing to be with, the kind that doesn't quit when things go wrong, the kind that faces his mistakes and fixes them. Can you do that?" Davis nodded, unable to speak. "Good." Harold released his shoulder. "Now go call your mother. She's probably seen the video by now and thinks you've been discharged." The video of Harold Briggs at the Memorial Day Parade has been viewed over 40 million times across various platforms. It's been featured on news programs around the world. It's been used in Marine Corps recruitment materials. It's been shown to every new class of silent drill platoon trainees as an example of what dedication looks like. But here's what those videos can't capture. Harold Briggs still practices every morning, alone in his garage with a broomstick that weighs approximately 11 pounds, because he added lead weights to the end. He doesn't perform for anyone. He doesn't record himself. He just runs through the movements. The same movements he learned 57 years ago. The same movements that his body refuses to forget. His wife of 46 years, Margaret, asked him once why he keeps practicing. He's retired. He's earned his rest. The platoon has moved on. New generations have learned and improved and built on what he created. Why does he keep picking up that broomstick every morning at 600? His answer was simple. "Because the day I stop," he said, "is the day I stop being the man who earned the right to do it. And I made a promise, to myself, to every Marine I trained, to the Corps, that I would be worthy of what they gave me for as long as I draw breath." He paused, looking at the broomstick leaning against the wall of his garage. Chrome paint on the handle, tape wrapped around the middle for grip, scratches from 10,000 impacts against his palm. "The rifle never gets lighter," he said. "Your hands just get stronger. That's not a lesson about drill. That's a lesson about life." There's a final detail about the Memorial Day Parade that most people don't know. After Harold finished meeting with the platoon, after the handshakes and the photographs and the tearful embraces from veterans who remembered his name, he walked back to his car alone. His cane clicked against the pavement. His windbreaker fluttered in the breeze. To anyone watching, he was just an old man heading home after a long day. But when he reached his car, he didn't get in right away. He stood there for a long moment, looking back at the parade grounds, at the American flag snapping in the wind, at the crowds dispersing, at the young Marines loading their rifles into transport cases, and then Harold Briggs came to attention, alone in a parking lot, 79 years old, his body protesting every inch of the movement. He raised his right hand in a crisp salute, held it for exactly 3 seconds, then dropped it. Not for anyone watching, not for recognition or applause or viral videos, for every Marine who ever wore the uniform, for everyone who ever dropped a rifle and picked it up again, for the idea that some things are worth practicing even when no one is watching, especially when no one is watching. The muscle memory never fades, neither does the honor. If this story moved you, wait until you hear what happened when a homeless veteran tried to enter the Medal of Honor Society dinner. The Secret Service response? You won't believe it.